You're listening to the Unwritable Rant podcast with your host and bourbon-soaked storyteller, Juliette Miranda.
Hey there, y'all. Welcome to episode 115. I'm Juliette, and this is the Unwritable Rant podcast. I have two stories for y'all today about SWAT team greetings and chicken dance retaliation. But before we get to the bourbon-soaked stories, y'all, we gotta do a little bit of bourbon drinking. It's time to fill up those glasses. Now raise them up, and let's say cheers. All right, today I am drinking Wild Turkey Kentucky Spirit. And I don't know why that makes me giggle, it just does. Although there's no age statement on this bourbon, it's said to have been aged about 8 or 9 years, and it clocks in at 101 proof. The mash bill is 75% corn, 13% rye, and 12% malted barley. This is a single barrel bourbon, which means that every batch is just slightly different than the last. And I'll tell you what I really like about this glass that I'm having right now is that it has a very sweet sort of smokiness. And overall, this is an incredibly well-balanced bourbon. But that being said, it's also a little unexciting to me. That sweet smokiness aside, this really does have the very typical sort of bourbon flavors. You've got a whole lot of cinnamon spice, and then it rounds out with some vanilla and just a touch of wood and leather. Very easy to drink on ice. I found that when I had this straight up, it was a little too much of an alcohol burn for my liking. So this isn't exactly my favorite bourbon in the whole entire world, but that doesn't make it bad. And I will say that if you are a fan of the Wild Turkey line in general, you will probably really like this, because it has that very classic Wild Turkey rye sort of flavor, but with the added benefit of a little bit of age. So I have some bad news. For us, anyway. We have new neighbors, and I hate them. Admittedly, the chances of my liking them were pretty slim, considering how much we absolutely adored our previous neighbors. Oh, they were so perfect. So perfect it was dreamy. For starters, they were child-free like us. They were respectful and quiet and thoughtful. And better yet, they knew how to leave well enough alone. They tolerated our driveway drinking beautifully, and would even, on occasion, join us for cigars and bourbon. Oh, how I cringed when I saw the moving van in their driveway. Few things suck more than breaking in new neighbors. It just seems like I've been forced to do this ever since I was a kid. Rather than welcome people to the neighborhood, my dad would actually take a batch of brownies and a bottle of champagne over to our new neighbors to apologize in advance for whatever mayhem he may cause. It was his attempt at preemptive damage control. Or maybe it was just a fair warning. I'm not really sure which. He'd use that opportunity to explain to the surprised and now very frightened neighbor exactly what they could expect living in proximity to a physicist who happened to have a fully functional high-voltage laboratory in the basement. He would reassure them that there was nothing to worry about, and explain that the loud noises and weird neon purple glow from the windows was perfectly normal. And my dad would always invite everyone over for a demonstration, and occasionally the more adventurous would take him up on the offer. But mostly, people would just kind of back away slowly and write my dad off as the town crank. But here's the thing, y'all. My dad's mistake was always in assuming that people understood what a high-voltage lab is. I mean, really, to see their expressions, they just kind of glazed over when he talked about it. And I'm assuming they just sort of figured it was on par with a craft room or maybe some sort of workshop. It wasn't until they actually experienced the lab in action that they really understood. And that's about when they would crack open that bottle of booze. My family moved to a new neighborhood when I started college. And for the first few months, we lived peacefully with everyone, until my dad got his laboratory up and running. One morning, he decided to put his latest high-voltage plasma generator through a series of tests. This wasn't unusual for him. My dad was always an early riser, and he would often creep down into his lab before the sun came up and toil away at whatever his current project was. He liked the still of the morning, and claimed that this is when his brain was at its best. I can't really speak to that, of course. I'm sure my dad is terrifyingly brilliant, and perhaps more so when he first wakes up, but he somehow always manages to overlook little details. It's always the little details. Like the fact that our new neighborhood was full of early morning dog walkers. I can only imagine what that trio of little old ladies thought when they were walking their precious terriers past our house that morning. You see, my dad was blasting high plasma arcs across the basement at the time. And let me just clarify for a moment. These are electric charges. Streamers, as my dad likes to call them, and they're somewhat similar to small-scale controlled lightning bolts. You know, in our basement. The buzzing current of these streamers in rapid succession is ridiculously loud and, unfortunately, not entirely dissimilar to the sound of a semi-automatic weapon. So when those three little old ladies passed our house that one autumn morning and heard the unexpected staccato rhythm and saw flashing lights coming from our basement, they immediately assumed the worst. They yanked those dogs into their arms and dove into the bushes for cover. One actually pressed the life alert panic button she was wearing, and the other two started screaming for assistance. This brought out another neighbor, who, upon hearing the unfamiliar popping coming from our basement, immediately assumed that the neighborhood was under siege and dialed 911. So all this is going on, right? My dad, completely oblivious to the commotion that he's causing. We all were. My mom was up, rooting around in the kitchen, and my sister and I were sound asleep. We'd managed to learn long ago how to sleep through all of my dad's scientific bumblings. In fact, I didn't wake up until I heard a really weird thumping sound on our roof. It was too loud and too deliberate to be squirrels. So in my still kind of half-asleep state, I peer through the blinds of my windows. And at first, I didn't see much. My eyes aren't entirely focused yet, but I swear I saw what looked like a huge black object scurrying up the side of the large oak tree in our yard. That definitely wasn't a squirrel. So I throw on a robe and I go looking for my mother. She's in the kitchen, sipping coffee and reading the paper, and my dad is still merrily blasting away in the basement. I'm just about to tell her about the weird thing I saw in the tree when there is violent pounding on our front door. And we hear muffled yelling, too. It seemed to be directed at us, but over the ruckus in the basement and the voices being filtered through the wood of our very heavy front door, it was really kind of hard to tell. So my mom and I just both meander up to the door, taking our sweet time. We were both still somewhat sleepy-eyed, and, well, we were definitely unconcerned. But, y'all, the second my mom opened the door, and I mean within half a heartbeat, we were greeted by an entire SWAT team in full-on armor with weapons raised. And they're yelling, "Arms up! Hands in the air!" Orders are being bellowed at us from every single direction, and I'll tell you, in that commotion, it is really hard to know what to do or where to look. My mom's trying to belt her robe around herself, and we're being yelled at and screamed at, and we're trying to do the best that we can to obey their commands. Obviously, neither one of us was armed at the time, so we were quickly escorted into our front yard for interrogation. My sister, meanwhile, was still sound asleep. So my mother tries to reason with the SWAT team. And me, I'm looking around, and I am staggered by the sheer magnitude of police force gathered just for us. The block has been shut down. There are SWAT team members in our trees, on our roof, and apparently even situated in the neighbors' yards. And as for our neighbors, they'd all been put on lockdown. At the far end of the block, those 3 little old ladies are sitting on stretchers and being administered oxygen. And in the distance, I hear more sirens, which can only mean more officers and maybe a fire truck. And I just took this all in, and I laughed. Clearly, in all of this mayhem, the one thing we weren't going to be seeing was a welcome wagon. It took quite a bit of explaining to assure the officers that no, my dad had not lost his mind, and he definitely wasn't launching some sort of attack. That didn't stop a parade of officers from marching into our basement to check, of course. We really did our best to prep them for what to expect down in the lab, but even with all the combat training in the world, no one really expects to walk into a room and have to dodge purple lightning. Fortunately, the officers were so fascinated by my dad's lab that they stayed for a full demonstration of its capabilities. Mind you, they still issued him a host of citations. Even the city attempted to get in on it later. But since my dad was on the board of directors of several high-profile scientific organizations that contributed to the city's development, well, the matter was just quickly dropped and forgotten. The neighbors, however, they weren't so forgiving. 2 houses were put on the market within 4 months of the incident. And although they never came right out and said it was due to my dad, judging by the way no one would walk on our side of the sidewalk, it was pretty apparent how they felt. Over the years, my parents have fostered better relationships with the neighbors, who begrudgingly tolerate the mad scientist across the street. But to this day, I am sure that they still talk in annoyed whispers about that one time my dad unwittingly introduced them to the town's SWAT team. And with that, I'm raising up my glass of bourbon and toasting to my crazy dad. Cheers. Whew, bourbon. You know, neighbors in general really are kind of a pain in the ass, especially in townhome communities like ours. The close proximity of the homes essentially puts you on top of each other, with little more than cinder blocks separating your neuroses and bad habits. And I will be the first to admit, my guy and I aren't exactly a treat to live next to. I mean, in our very first apartment together, apparently the sounds of us having sex were so enraging that we drove a neighbor to murder the snowman we built. And then, well, there's always the driveway drinking and random fires. But really, I swear, we do our best to keep to ourselves and respect shared spaces. But our new neighbors? Not so much. For starters, they block our garage with their trash cans. Heaven forbid they take the extra steps to wheel those stinking receptacles into their designated storage space. Instead, they just fling the cans onto the shared space between our garages and leave them there all week long, leaving us to absorb the stench of their filth every time we open the garage door. And then, there's the noise. It's been several weeks since they moved in, and I'm still not entirely sure how many people live there. But judging by the amount of stair-pounding, fighting, commotion, and banging, I'd say they've packed a good 30 or 40 people into that 2-bedroom townhome. And believe me, it's not that the walls are thin. We lived next door to our previous neighbors for 5 years before we learned that the guy was a DJ and had turned their spare bedroom into a beat lab. So no, these people, they're just plain rude and deliberately loud. And you know what they're really loud about? Karaoke. For the amount of time that they spend warbling away on Nickelback's greatest hits, You would think the guy was in training for an American Idol of the Damned competition. And it's not just during the daytime. Oh, no. This guy gets the urge to slaughter 90s rock tragedies at all hours, sometimes straining his rotten vocal cords all the way until 2 a.m. His cohabitating lady friend is a perpetual audience, often cheering him on with high-pitched cheers and the occasional backing vocals. My guy and I were willing to be nice about this at first, because who knows? Maybe these karaoke crapholes don't realize how much their voices carry through the cinder block. But after an especially long night of vocal massacres, my guy decided to say something. One of our neighbors was in their garage one Saturday morning. He looked to be in his early 30s or so and had all the classic trappings of a complete and total douchebag. For starters, he was wearing capri pants and a tank top. I suspect somewhere in the dark recesses of his closet, there's also a trucker hat with the tag deliberately still attached that he will wear backwards. Our suburban situation nods by way of greeting and looks utterly exhausted to have to say hello. Now, my guy is polite. So much more polite than I could ever be. So he starts by introducing himself. The two exchange a few strained pleasantries. And then my guy makes his request. He says, "Hey, by the way, your karaoke parties sound like a blast, but they're kind of loud. Would you mind turning the volume down after 10 p.m.? Now, this is a totally reasonable request. But the neighbor looks at my guy, rolls his eyes, and says, "Dude, we just met, and you're already telling us we're loud? Fuck off." My guy stomps into the house to relate this encounter to me. He is annoyed, but level-headed. My guy isn't quite prone to the same rage fits that I am. His big fix for this problem is to call the cops the next time their caterwauling runs late. Call the cops? When has that ever worked in our town? Screw that. Clearly, I'm going to have to take this problem into my own hands. And I knew the only way to make an impression with neighbors like this is to beat them at their own game. They had no idea what kind of maniac they were dealing with. The second the karaoke kicked in, and believe me, it didn't take long, I was ready. I had a playlist set to infinite repeat, comprised of the 3 most obnoxious songs I had immediately available: Friends in Low Places, Summer of Fucking 69, and Grease Lightning. I had toyed with playing just one of these songs all day long, but I didn't want to just torture these people. I wanted them to know that this was war. The first time through the playlist, I'm sure they just thought we had shitty taste in music. By the 10th rotation, well, all I can hope is that they went to bed that night and dreamed about Jimmy and Jody and all the places where beer chases the blues away. Not surprisingly, the next day they launched a counterattack of their own, with a stereo-connected Xbox and 6 hours of Need for Speed. Silly neighbors. Their attempt at noise retaliation was almost cute. Ooh, engines revving. What they couldn't have known is that my childhood included endless hours on the drag strip with my dad, watching nitro-injected fuel funny cars. So the sounds of electric cars whizzing around a video game? Yeah, you're gonna have to try harder than that to crush me. I laughed, my guy. A weird, evil sort of laughter that makes him take a couple of steps away from me. He tries to talk me out of what I have planned next. He's saying something about taking the high road, whatever the hell that means. These people, they disrespected us first. They blew off our attempts at being civil. Their funky trash cans are still sitting next to our garage. And damn it, I hate Nickelback. They had to go down. It was time to break into my hidden stash of horror movies. I collect depraved horror movies much the same way some people collect porn. These aren't your average, everyday horror movies like Annabelle or Friday the 13th. These are the kind of films so appalling and so disturbing, there's no dialogue, only screaming. They're the kind of movies that make you feel like your mind has been run through a meat grinder. And I had some real gems to share with our neighbors. Well, it turns out our neighbors were more resilient than I had anticipated. Several hours of tortured wails and power tools had done nothing but fuel their battle plan. And the very next day, in response, they set up what can only be described as a living room racquetball court. Each time a ball would bounce off our common wall, which was approximately every 7 seconds or so, my guy would shoot me a look. A not-so-nice look that blamed me for this whole predicament. Clearly, my guy was drowning himself in if-onlys. If only we had just called the cops the first time. If only we had our old neighbors back. If only he had married a sane woman. Now, not being privy to the wilds of my brain, I could understand his frustration. I could. And admittedly, I had not expected the tennis ball counterstrike. That move was well played on their end. But I wasn't done yet. I still had one more attack to launch, and this one would not fail. I look at my guy and I say, "Call the band." He looks confused at first. Then slowly, understanding sparks in his eyes, and he sees my evil genius clearly. The band. Every so often, my guy helps out a certain local band by producing their demos. Calling them a band doesn't really do them enough justice. These guys are more human jukebox than band. Far as I know, there isn't a single song from any genre they don't know. They make an exceedingly good living performing at weddings and corporate events, and would be exactly what our living room needed. And since they owed us a favor or two, they were happy to haul all their rehearsal gear over for a mostly private performance one afternoon. You see, that was part of the evil genius of my neighbor attack. All of our hardcore noises, the music, the screams, and now, the band, would all be taking place during the hours of noon and 10 p.m. It was the one thing that we held over our neighbors. Sure, we were being obnoxious and definitely not neighborly, but we were, at the very least, legal. Well, legal and slightly insane. We had the band open their set with the chicken dance song. A song so obnoxious, it makes pounding thumbtacks into your eardrums seem preferable. And oh, it was loud. It was perfect. We're talking 5-piece band crammed into our little living room. Admittedly, we couldn't fit an entire drum kit into the space, and we didn't want to press our luck by having the band play with their stage amps. But even with the pared-down setup, it was more than enough to rattle the windows and shake a little paint off the walls. The band rehearsed the chicken dance song 3 or 4 times, just to make sure it was perfect. Then they went into Fuck You by CeeLo Green. After that, they played a little Justin Bieber, a Lady Gaga and Madonna mashup, and, just for fun, the chicken dance song. It was the single most glorious revenge performance ever. Our neighbors didn't stand a chance. Sure, they thought they'd be clever and try to escape for an hour, but the second they came home, we greeted them with another round of Fuck You. The band serenaded our neighbors with every horrible song in their repertoire, while I sat back and waited for the white flag to wave. It was the Hokey Pokey that did it. We were all putting our left legs in when the doorbell rang. I let the band keep playing while I ran to answer it. And what do you know? It's the douchey neighbor. This time wearing athletic shorts, crew socks, and slide sandals. He's holding out a bottle of wine and hands it to me. And he says, "A wedding band, huh?" I nod and I smile. And the band in the background switches over to YMCA. The douchebag shudders just a little bit and he says, "Truce?" I nod again and agree. He's about to turn around and head home when I call out, "Hey, by the way, move your fucking garbage cans." Oh, victory has never sounded so blissfully quiet. All is once again well in our little suburban jungle. And as for any potential future neighbors who may be listening to this podcast right now, let me just leave you with this little niblet of advice. Don't challenge crazy. And by crazy, I mean me. Because I do not play fair. And I usually win in the end. And if I don't, there's always bourbon. Oh, y'all, thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Unwritable Rant podcast. Head on over to theunwritablerant.com and make sure you sign up for my newsletter. Coming out in just a couple of weeks, I will be releasing my top 5 favorite bourbons of 2017. There may even be a special video attached to it. Who knows? And now I have some more bourbon to drink and some more trouble to find. I'll be back to share more bourbon-soaked stories with y'all next Sunday. Cheers.
Go to theunwritablerant.com and sign up to get early access to interviews and new videos. You can hear new episodes of The Unwritable Rant on radiovegas.rocks every Tuesday at 4 p.m. Eastern and on IPMNation.com on Saturdays and Sundays at 6 p.m. Eastern, and hear best of episodes every weekday at 3 p.m. Eastern. And don't forget to connect with Juliette on Twitter at Morning Neurosis.
Girl, you was pretty as a Sunday morning, standing on the corner at Carondelet. What you say we make our way up to Bourbon, a couple hurricanes and a hand grenade, and get blown away. Let the chips fall where they may. If it's all the same, what you say, bon ton relay. Hey, pretty mama, I can smell the gumbo. Sweetest taste of honeysuckle on my lips. Good God Almighty, I can hear the trombone. Every heart ought to beat to a rhythm like this. Come a little closer, honey, let me hold you. Nothing tastes better than a bourbon kiss. You can be the flower on my magnolia. Every heart ought to beat to a rhythm like this.